Hello, this is Dr. Alan Yim. In this video, I'm going to show you some ways of analyzing chords actually in the music, specifically triads. So we're going to look at how to recognize triads in a piece of music and actually take a look at the very first type of second inversion chord, which is the pedal 6/4. Okay, first off, let's take a look at this first circle that I have here. And notice this is in the key of C, and we're going to try to figure out what this chord is. Now if you just look at the right hand, in other words what's in the treble clef, you might notice that this is an inverted chord. We're going to take the whole thing all together, and so how do you recognize what inversion this is? Well, you look for that interval of a fourth, and remember, you look for notes that are different. You can recognize the fourth because we have here a space to a line note. Not, for example, like this, which is a space to a space. That's a third. So here we can recognize right away, this is a fourth. The fourth is in the bottom of the chord. So if it's in the bottom of the chord, is that a 6/4 or is it a 6? In other words, first inversion or second. Well, if it's in the bottom, the chord, when you write it out, is going to look like this. And this is a 6 and a fourth. So this is the second inversion 6/4. Just the right hand is in second inversion. It sounds like this. So that's the second inversion, C over G. You could also look at the lowest note, of course, and notice that it's the fifth of the chord. But this whole chord is in root position because the lowest note is the root. So we look at the lowest note of the chord. In this case, it's in the bass, this. So the whole measure, and this whole thing, let's put it up here in a big letter, is a C major triad. So as we might expect, the piece begins with a 1 chord. Now the most common progression, of course, is 5/1. And you're going to expect that all of the major ending points are going to be, they're going to have that chord progression. So when you're doing an analysis, I would recommend always looking for the cadences, in other words, the end of the phrases, and look for a 5/1 progression. We're not going to do this right now, but instead I'm going to show you 2 more chords, and let's proceed then. So look at the next little circle here, and see if you can, just at a glance, what is that inversion? And I'll give you a clue. Where's the fourth? Well, here's a space to a line, so that's the fourth. The fourth is on top. So it looks like probably it's going to be something like this, right? Because the gap is on the top, and there's always the 6, and this is a 3. So this looks like a first inversion chord, and indeed it is. So this is D over F sharp. Okay, so that's first inversion. Let's look at this one in the third circle here. And what I want to point out here, this is a chord that might throw you off a little bit, but there's a second in it. And I mentioned that when there's a second, you probably have a 7th chord. And again, which note is the root? It's the top of the second, and then the bottom would be the 7th. So if that's the case, what would this chord be spelled out? Well, if D is the bottom of the 7th, we just go up in thirds, D, F, A, C. It's easy because we're in C major. We don't have to worry about any accidentals. So this looks like it might be a D minor 7th chord. We have an A here as the lowest note. Now, when you're working in something like this, where we have a bunch of notes, look for the note that's the lowest one. Usually it will be on the downbeat, and if it is, for sure, that's the position of the chord. So we have here the 5th of the chord in the bass. Now you might be saying to yourself, well, this is looking a little bit weird because the 3rd of the chord, the F, is missing. Well, this is a thing, it's for pianists. There won't be a mistake. You can tell that this is a 7th chord, and when it's inverted like this, it's really to enable the pianist to be able to play this easily, but you could tell that this is some kind of a 7th chord, even without that missing, with the missing 3rd, the 3rd not being there. So we'll leave it at this. This is a D minor 7th over A. So it's second inversion. I put down here 4-3. So if you do see a second in a chord, check to see whether you have a 7th chord. That's inverted. Now, let's go take a look at the pedal 6-4. Okay, so I'm going to scroll down a little bit. So this is the third movement of the same sonata in C major, and right away you can see a very obvious chord, I hope for you, in bass clef. Sounds like this. That is, of course, a C major triad, and the beginning of this piece, this movement, the third movement, is in C. This is a very short little sonatina by Clementi, and a lot of piano students learn this pretty early on when they're learning piano. Okay, the next one, the next change is here. And again, notice, it looks like we have a 7th chord. It looks like we have that D minor 7th over C. However, I should point out that, look, all of the starting notes in all of those 4 measures is C. And the only thing that changes in this measure are these 2 notes. So if I just play the left hand, the question is this really a chord change? D minor 7th over C. Well, in this case, I'm going to leave this one alone because this is not a second inversion triad. It looks like it's a third inversion 7th chord. Okay, and we can recognize that again because of this bit here. But it does bring up a point, and that is the C, the bass note, doesn't change. So we call this a pedal. And where does this come from? Well, back in the old days when you had an organist playing the organ, they played all the bass notes, and still today, they play the bass notes with their feet in the pedals. So the C pedal means that you're playing the C in the footboard, and it would be the lowest note because the feet play the bass notes. On the organ, well, most of the time. You can actually change the part of the organ that's being controlled by the foot pedals, but normally it would be the bass notes. So that's where we get this term pedal. Okay, so you could just think of this as the bass. Now let's take a look at one where it actually is just a triad and a second inversion chord. So here we have an example of this. This happens to be, this part of it happens to sort of, well, it's a G chord here. I won't say anything further than that, but this is a G triad. And how do you know? Well, first of all, you can look at this and you can see that right here the G is doubled. You might say the 5th is missing, but yeah, well, up here there is a D up here. But you could tell what this is just purely by the repetition of the G and what comes before and after it. So here's before, right? I don't think you would mistake this chord for an E minor, for example. You know, in inversion, no, that's not going to be possible. So, and this. Okay, so. Now, you might notice that it does seem like the chord changes a little bit here and here, and then it goes back to what we had before. So in the part in red, the chord appears to be C over G. So this would be a second inversion C major triad, and you can see it right here. Okay, so we have G, C, and E. Again, you could recognize this because we have a 4th on the bottom, and it looks like this if I write it in closed position. There's the 4th, so 4, and then of course this is the 6th. So this is a 6-4 chord, and well, this happens to be a pedal 6-4. So this is the very first one that we talked about here, because notice the G continues on. So it's really the bass that determines this. The bass pedal determines that this is a pedal 6-4 because the bass is not changing, even though we have and we have a 6/4 chord in the middle. So again, it sounds like this. Right? It's basically, what does this mean? Well, in this use of the 6/4, that middle pedal 6/4 does not count as part of the chord progression. We can write it in. Let's imagine we're in the key of G, which we're not, but let's imagine. Okay, we're in the key of G. That would be the 1 chord. This would be 4, 6, 4. If you want to place it there and write C over G, you could put it in parentheses like that. But it's really not part of the chord progression. This whole thing is just, you should just consider the whole part in these brackets to be in the key of G. So I'll play this whole little section for you. I mean, not in the key of G, but just to be the G chord. And maybe there's some other little bit of harmonization above it, but it's not really a chord progression. It doesn't go anywhere. So this pedal 6/4 is just a little bit of an ornamentation of that pedal G. So here it is. Oh, sorry. So that whole thing, you could just consider that a G chord. Thanks for watching. That's the pedal 6/4. In the next video, we'll take a look at the passing 6/4.